Stun the enemy, do a chain attack, and totalize the enemy. That's it, that's a Hugo game plan. Or is it? Well, the video is 13 minutes long, so spoilers, it's not just that. Hugo Vlad is easily the most interesting character ZZ has released so far because how he fundamentally changes one of the core mechanics of the game. In this video, I'll explain everything there is to know about Hugo Vlad, how you can make him do more damage, as well as why most people are probably underrating him. Minus the big elephant in the room. So that one sentence summary of his kit is more or less how he plays, but let me explain what this actually means in the context of a fight. For almost every other character in the game, this is what a damage graph would look like. The x-axis is time, the y-axis is DPS, so the area under the line is the total damage dealt in the fight. Obviously in an actual fight, it would look like this, but rectangles are easy to look at. Now some characters like Shiyu or Harumasa's might look more like this, someone like a Sambi or Jane Doe might be more flat, and a properly played Mono Ice Miyabi might look like this. The peaks represent the usually 15-second stun window where characters can do the rotation, unleash their burst, and the low parts represent actually fighting the enemy where you parry, build gauges, and prepare for the next stun window. Hugo would fall into the burst category with Shiyu and Harumasa, but there are some problems with this typical game plan for them. Most DPS characters have some sort of resource in addition to energy and decibels, and those two are no different. Usually spend the time between stuns making sure you have enough resources to go into the next stun window, because otherwise you're sad and have to wait for the next stun to do damage, assuming you didn't kill it on the first stun. So even though you want to stun the enemy to do damage, you can't stun them too fast. And you're generally really sad when the boss doesn't quite need a full stun rotation to finish it off, but you also kind of have to stun it again because otherwise you don't have enough damage to quite finish it. So how does Hugo fix this problem? Well, it's really obvious. His DPS graph looks something more like this. You're no longer restricted by resources, so you no longer have to stun and can just go ham stunning enemies as fast as possible. Okay, that's kind of a lie, but I'll get to that later. He fundamentally does damage differently from other characters because his damage cycles are much quicker. In the time that most characters do one stun cycle, Hugo with his 2 stunners probably will have done 2 or 3. Now Hugo's stun cycle obviously does less damage than other characters' stun cycles, but he does far more to compensate. And since he does more stun cycles, you're less likely to run into that not quite enough damage problem, and if you do, well, I've got the solution to that in this video. And looking at this, it becomes obvious that there are exactly 2 ways to boost the damage Hugo does. Either boost the damage of a stun cycle, or do more of them. So, let's focus on those 2 goals. Getting more stuns mostly hinges on your stunners, so I won't talk about that too much because that will depend from character to character. The one thing I will say is that parries are important since those almost always will help you stun the enemy faster than whatever you could do on field. And you can do dodge counter parries to get more days. To do so, just dodge counter and parry at the same time. It's generally tricky, but at a certain point, this is one of the only things you can do to build up more days than what's possible. Just try to not parry with Hugo since that will start messing up with his Hormone Punk timing. Now the fun stuff with Hugo. Let's start with the basics. In my intro, I said the plan is to stun, chain attack, and totalize. Well, against a boss enemy, there's 2 more chain attacks, so one option, and the most common option, is to do a second chain attack with Hugo. After all, it does get boosted damage from his additional ability. This is usually good, and especially in this current Deadly Assault with his buff to chain attacks, you're almost always going to do this. But there is one problem, which is that this is slower than just doing one chain attack, and because it takes more time, it can actually cause a stun cycle in Deadly Assault, or it might just be overkill in Shiyu Defense. So there are actually more options. Hugo's skill actually has a pretty long animation time. So during this time, you can activate another chain attack, and the Totalize will still go off. Now the stunner chain attacks usually aren't that remarkable, but hey, it stays towards the next stun and builds up some decibels. However, we can make this more interesting. Swing Jazz applies a buff when the equipper uses a chain attack. But what's interesting is that this can actually buff the totalized damage even though it's cast before the chain attack. As we can see here, it works. Also, if you're running Lycon, and you should if you have him, if you didn't apply his additional ability, you can apply it during this chain attack, and it will still benefit the Totalize. Granted, we can't really do this if you want to use Hugo's ult, so either you'll have to chain attack with that stunner or do double chain attack, and I've usually found that doing double chain attack is more damage. You can even do a second chain attack with Hugo this way. If you time it right, the Totalize will go off and Hugo will do a chain attack on the no longer stun enemy. This won't benefit from the stun multiplier anywhere, but this is a good way to get to that next stun cycle faster while giving Hugo some decibels. This one isn't quite as useful, but I've still found uses for doing this. Remember though, if you want to do this, you have to time it well because chain attacks will make your character stop whatever they're doing to do it. So, don't activate. If you want to do a chain attack with Hugo after the Totalize, don't activate the chain attack too early. Okay, now that we're done with chain attacks, let's talk about the actual meat of Hugo's kit, which is Totalize. So we have to understand exactly how Totalize works. Totalize deals damage based on how long the stun meter has left, capping at 15 seconds. So how can we manipulate the stun meter to do as much Totalize damage as possible? First, we can use Lighter's collapse, but that has nothing to do with Hugo himself. What's not as obvious is that Hugo is an ice agent and his anomaly is freeze. Freeze is really interesting because this anomaly actually stops the stun timer. It's not a fake pause, it actually just stops ticking down while the target is frozen. If you've ever watched a high-level mono ice rotation with Miyabi, this is basically the core concept behind that team. Now, most of what Hugo does during a stun rotation will shatter the target and break that freeze, but those extra seconds bought by the freeze do make a difference. Even with Lighter's extra 3 seconds, he won't cap out the Totalize damage since chain attacks and skill and ultimate animations will take longer than 3 seconds when you use at least 2 of them. There isn't a lot you can do to manipulate the anomaly, but there is still enough that I should mention it. First, I should talk about his charge attack. It's probably the least important part of his damage besides probably actual basic attacks, but this does squeeze some extra anomaly. It's generally a good idea to at least get the first level before swapping to another stunner after the Totalize. But the more important thing is that doing these charge shots generates energy. This affords you some energy to use skill in between stuns to make sure that the freeze lands in the stun window. Finally, another useful tip is knowing how to save a freeze for the stun window. Lycan's X will not freeze until the last hit, so you can swap off before that last part hits and then parry back to him to freeze for the stun window. You can also swap during any animation to save it. Also, I should shout out Sharkboo. His anomaly helps even if it's not the biggest deal. Maybe in the future some super genius will figure out a perfect rotation to always freeze during stun rotations, but I'm not sure if it's possible for now without sacrificing too much days. The next tip isn't about manipulating the stun bar, but it is just useful relevant information. The stun timer that Totalize is calculated on starts when the stun goes rainbow. So to maximize the total Totalize damage, we really want to not waste any time when the stun bar turns rainbow. The other reason this is important to know is that there's something that eats away at your stun time that's not as obvious. And that's if you're doing 2 chain attacks, no matter which 2, you have to reactivate the chain attack. Even this small time that I'm using to reactivate the chain attack is eating away at the Totalize damage. It is no secret that Lighter is Hugo's best partner, and this is yet again just another one of their synergies. Lighter's quick assist is by far and away the fastest way to reactivate a chain attack out of all the stunners, but most other stunners have quick ways to proc the chain attack. It will vary from character to character. There is one last piece to the puzzle to maximizing Hugo's damage, which is utilizing Hormone Punk to its fullest potential. Ideally, you are doing perfect 20-second stun rotations from the time Hugo takes the field to the next stun, but reality isn't perfect. The best way to keep the timer aligned is to take a peek at the timer every time Hugo takes the field and add 20 seconds. That will be when Hormone Punk is next available. Also remember that it will first take effect when Hugo either attacks or gets switched into combat, not when Hugo enters the stage. Last, if you're a bit too early, you can just stand there and swap characters real quick, but you will lose Totalize damage, but the Hormone Punk buff is usually stronger anyway, and doing this can help keep your timer stay on track. Now the other part to making Hugo's damage as big as possible is his build. I usually don't talk about builds since I find gameplay much more important, and builds are generally not very complicated to figure out. But Hugo is different. I'll talk about his teammates first. Something that's easy to overlook is that your stunner's skill levels are important. Like I said earlier, the ways to increase Hugo's damage is more stuns and better stuns, and his skill levels are very important to doing so. Now the distress sets. The stats don't matter as much, just make sure you have impact on the 6. But what is important are the sets. Protopunk, in my opinion, is essential to a Hugo team unless the enemy just almost never gives you a parry like UCC. Because parries are essential to stunning the enemy as fast as possible, it's easy to activate. However, its duration is so short that the only way to ensure it's active is to stun the enemy with a parry. For your other stunner, it's between Swing Jazz and Shockstar Disco. I'm usually a massive hater of Shockstar Disco because the amount of time you save on a stun is extremely minimal for most characters since most days is built through parries and skills. However, if you're trying to improve your deadly assault score or going for better Shiyu Defense clear, every second can count, and that's where Shockstar Disco can come in. Otherwise, I'd recommend Swing Jazz because even if you don't use the chain attack trick, you'll occasionally get that damage bonus when you ult. Now for Hugo's build. For a set, go for Hormone Punk, if only because nothing else really synergizes that well. If you cannot manage the timer for your life, you can go for Woodpecker. Just remember the basic attack before your Totalize. If you don't have his signature W engine, it is extremely tempting to go all in on crit rate so your Totalizes never fail to crit. But what's important to remember is the gacha game golden ratio. Not that one, the 1 to 2 crit rate to crit damage ratio. It basically means that your damage will be maximized if you have 1 crit rate for every 2 crit damage. Why this is unimportant because that's calculus, so if you're curious you can look it up. I won't bore you with the calculus, it's basically the optimization problem. The reason that's important is that if you give up your crit damage for too much crit rate, even if your Totalize never fails to crit, you are giving up too much on your other stats. Hugo's non-Totalize damage is significant, as you can see here from this rotation. The Totalize is only about 60%-ish of the total damage, so obey the gold ratio. There are exceptions, such as stage buffs giving crit damage or elemental damage buffs. For example, on this stage, because of how much crit damage it gives, I can swap out my disc 4 for attack percent and get more damage overall. But most people probably just want to use one build and stick with that. But if you want to test a build, it's actually fairly simple. If you got 2 different builds and you're not sure which one is better, you can just go into a stage, totalize an enemy, and compare the numbers. Most of the time, unless you wasted time doing the totalize, you will get a pretty close comparison. And obviously, you can sacrifice some crit rate for damage, but I'll leave it up to you whether or not you value consistency or if you don't mind seeing that totalize fail a crit. I'll finish this video by talking about how these tips can actually put to use in the actual endgame content in Shiyu Defense and Deadly Assault. Your approaches to these stages will be different since obviously they have different goals. In Shiyu Defense, you won't need to go through that many totalizes. Not to be pedantic, but it will be pretty obvious how many totalizes you'll need to kill an enemy just by looking at how much one does. So instead of doing a full rotation, you can actually just skip some steps. One way is doing the chainer stun attack instead of the double chain like I mentioned earlier. And at the end of the fight, you can even skip the chain attacks altogether if you think that is enough damage to kill it. Shiyu Defense enemies are also easier to stun, so you might try to squeeze in 2 totalizes into the same Hormone Punk window. I've tried, and while it's technically possible, I couldn't fit in a second chain attack before the second totalize. The Hormone Punk buff is stronger than the crit buffs the chain attacks provide, but unless that second totalize is killing the enemy, it's usually more damage to just let the Hormone Punk fall off and do the second chain attack. Last, it's worth mentioning that Hugo's skill only does the totalize at the end of the animation. So even if the enemy isn't stunned at the start of the cast, if it is by the end, it will get totalized. This is mostly applicable to the first wave. The enemies might be at 1 HP depending on how you do it because allies cannot kill enemies from off field. So if they aren't at 1 HP, that means your stunner was able to get that last hit to make it seem like that Hugo one-shot the enemies. In Deadly Assault, you've got to fit in as many stun windows into that 3 minutes as possible. Well, you also have to consider the quality of each of those stuns too. Your damage will be the absolute highest if you can double chain every single stun, but fights have variance. You might not get as many parries as you'd like, so the enemy doesn't get stunned fast enough, or the boss does something cringe and ruins your flow. It's really up to you whether or not you're trying to score as high as possible, or if you just want that 20k score. I would recommend double chaining, but if you fall short, try doing the stunner chain combo instead to see if that lets you squeeze in another totalize. You do want to line up your totalizes with Hormone Punk if it's possible, unless it's the last totalize, so do keep that in mind. For this reason, it's generally a good idea to not double stun or ult the boss in the same stun rotation, but if the boss has some downtime like the marionettes, by all means do it. It seems like Hugo is being very overlooked, and it's understandable. He's a 3rd ice DPS, a male, and placed right before a Void Hunter who by nature just seems like she'll be broken, if Miyabi is anything to go by. I think it's a shame because Hugo is incredibly fun. He actually lets you stun the enemy as fast as you want, and those totalized numbers never fail to be extremely satisfying. So let me know in the comments if I've convinced you to pull Hugo, if you found anything helpful or interesting, or if I missed something. If you're now interested in Hugo and are interested in what you should invest in for his team, you can check out this video. Thanks for watching, like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time.